This is Mrs. Miller, your teacher at ELA Academy. Today, we're talking about sentence types. If you haven't already, be sure to watch the other videos in this series, particularly the ones about conjunctions and clauses. Otherwise, you might be a little lost. This might sound weird, but there's some controversy on just what a sentence is exactly. The main disagreement is between the two big political parties in the grammar world, the prescriptive group and the descriptive group. If you believe in enforcing a strict set of grammar rules that never change, then you're in favor of prescriptive grammar. If you believe instead that grammar should describe the many different ways that people use language, then you favor descriptive grammar. As an English teacher and lifelong lover of reading, I can't help but sit at the prescriptive table. I've spent so many hours, days, years reading the English language filtered through editors that sometimes it's almost physically painful to see grammatical errors in print. But at the same time, I'm a little bit of a rebel. Sometimes I use fragments, sometimes I begin a sentence with a fanboy's conjunction or end it with a preposition, and I almost always split my infinitives. You can blame that on Star Trek. I've grown up steeped in the dialect of the American South with all of its fixin'-tos and y'alls. I love reading fiction that tries to duplicate local dialects because it has the flavor of real people that's sometimes lost in strictly standard English. If people aren't standardized, then why should grammar be? But since I'm only partly a rebel, I'm still going to give you a definition. A sentence consists of one or more clauses correctly joined with some kind of end punctuation. If that definition just confused you, then you might not have watched my clause videos yet. Go ahead and fix that now. We'll wait. Okay, so we're going to talk about 4 kinds of sentences: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Don't be fooled by the name of this one. A simple sentence is one independent clause by itself, like this one. Santa delivers presents. Take a moment to identify the subject and verb. Remember, we color code subjects blue and verbs red. Not only is this a single independent clause, but it's also literally simple, only 3 words. But remember, I told you not to be fooled by the name, because this is also a simple sentence. On Christmas Eve, a fat, jolly Santa and 8 tiny reindeer deliver colorfully wrapped presents to well-behaved children around the world. Do you see the subject and verb? Same verb as the first example, but this one has a compound subject. Who does the delivering? Santa and his reindeer. But even with 2 subjects, we're still just dealing with one independent clause. The extra stuff is just a prepositional phrase, some adjectives, more adjectives, direct object, indirect object, prepositional phrase. 22 words. So even though it might not seem simple with all of these extra modifiers and phrases, it's still called a simple sentence. It's all about how many and what kind of clauses the sentence has. Let's look at a couple of examples in literature. This is a simple sentence from Elie Wiesel's speech, The Perils of Indifference. What will the legacy of this vanishing century be? Take a moment to identify the subject and verb. Remember, in a question, the subject and verb are inverted. The verb comes first. And in this case, we have quite a bit of distance between the helping verb and the main verb, but one independent clause, so this is a simple sentence. Let's look at another one. This is a sentence from Emily Bronte's novel, Wuthering Heights. Above the chimney were sundry villainous old guns and a couple of horse pistols, and by way of ornament, 3 gaudily painted canisters disposed along its ledge. Take a moment to identify the subject and verb. Did you happen to say that chimney is the subject? I threw you a bit of a curveball here. Remember in the last video that I said prepositional phrases can sometimes trick you? Well, above the chimney is a prepositional phrase. The object of the preposition cannot also be the subject of a sentence. Let's take a moment to figure this out. The verb is were. What is it that were something? The guns, horse pistols, and canisters were sitting above the chimney. This is another example of inverted sentence structure, which some people like to call Yoda sentences. It's not a question, but like a question, the subject comes after the verb. Inverted sentences can be a little tricky to analyze, especially if you aren't expecting them, but if you always start by identifying the verb, you should be fine. Okay, so a simple sentence is one independent clause by itself. A compound sentence has two or more independent clauses joined correctly. In the last video, we talked about one way to join them, with a comma plus a fanboys conjunction. But there are two more options, with a colon or with a semicolon. Let's see what that looks like. Santa delivers presents and children open them. Two independent clauses joined by a comma plus a fanboys conjunction. Don't forget to leave cookies for Santa. He's working hard to deliver gifts. This is an imperative sentence with an implied you as the subject. We used a colon here because the second independent clause helps to explain the first. Why should we leave cookies for Santa? Because he's worked hard. One more. Santa checks his list one final time. The elves load the sleigh. We used a semicolon to join these clauses because they're related. Both Santa and the elves are doing things to get ready to deliver presents. Ready to see compound sentences in literature? Let's have some more Elie Wiesel. He was finally free, but there was no joy in his heart. Find the subjects and verbs and see how the two clauses are joined. This one has a comma plus a fanboys conjunction. Next. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. Go ahead and find subjects, verbs, and how the clauses are joined. These are joined with a semicolon. So far, we've just worked with independent clauses. It's time to mix it up. A complex sentence has one independent clause plus one or more dependent or relative clauses. Notice that you can only have one independent clause. If you have more than one, it'll be a different kind of sentence. Yeah, I know, kind of weird, but hey. Now, we talked about punctuating the complex sentence in the last video. If the independent clause comes first, you don't need a comma or anything else to join the clauses. But if the dependent clause comes first, you need to use a comma. Let's look at some examples. Santa delivers presents because he has a generous heart. Here we have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. See how this clause begins with an awubis word? In this order, we don't need a comma in between. But if we reverse the order, because Santa has a generous heart, he delivers presents, we have a dependent clause followed by an independent. So we do need a comma in between. So let's look at some complex sentences in literature. This one is from Barbara Jordan's keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in 1976. Now that I have this grand distinction, what in the world am I supposed to say? Take a moment to identify the subjects and verbs as well as any subordinating conjunctions. Also, figure out whether we should have a comma between clauses. This one was a little tricky because its subordinating conjunction is less common. It isn't one of the awubis words. Now that is the subordinating conjunction. Yes, it's two words. That can happen. Conjunctions and prepositions can do that. Since the subordinating conjunction is here, that means that we have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. That also means that we need a comma in between. Let's try another one. This is from a speech by General Douglas MacArthur. No physical courage and no brute instinct can take the place of the divine help which alone can sustain him. Find the subjects, verbs, and any conjunctions and decide whether we need a comma. There we go. Instead of a subordinating conjunction, we have a relative pronoun here, which means we're dealing with an independent clause followed by a relative clause. And since it's acting like the subject of a clause, I've underlined it in blue. Also, since the independent clause comes first, we do not need a comma. Okay, remember that the complex sentence could only have one independent clause, while we could theoretically tack on as many dependent or relative clauses as we liked. Well, if you throw more than one independent clause in there, it becomes a compound complex sentence. Let's look at an example. After the elves make millions of toys, they load them into a sleigh and Santa delivers them around the world. Here we have a subordinating conjunction. This one's an awubis word, so we're starting with a dependent clause. When the dependent clause comes first, you need a comma in between. Then we have a couple of independent clauses joined by a comma plus a fanboys conjunction. This part makes it compound, independent plus independent, and the dependent clause makes it complex, a compound complex sentence. You know the drill. Let's check it out in literature. This is from Barbara Jordan's speech again. This we must do as individuals. And if we do it as individuals, there is no president of the United States who can veto that decision. Identify the subjects, verbs, and conjunctions. The first is an independent clause. We know that because there's no conjunction at the beginning. Next, this is interesting, we have a comma plus fanboys followed immediately by an awubis word. We could talk about why that happens here, but I think it would take too long and be boring. Students, you might see if your teacher will give you extra credit for coming up with an explanation. Anyways, so clause number 2 is dependent, then there's no conjunction here, so we have another independent, and then notice the relative pronoun, we end with a relative clause. The two independent clauses make it compound, and the dependent and relative clauses make it complex. Let's try one more. This is another quote from Great Expectations. His eyes looked so awfully hungry, too, that when I handed him the file and he laid it down on the grass, it occurred to me that he would have tried to eat it if he had not seen my bundle. Take a moment to identify any subjects, verbs, and conjunctions you find. I'll give you a hint. The word that was omitted somewhere in this quote. You'll need to figure out where in order to locate a relative clause. There you go. Did you find the omitted that? There. It occurred to me that he would have tried to eat it. So let's see where our independent and dependent clauses are. The first clause has no conjunctions at the beginning, so that's easy, independent. The next one has an awubis word, when, so it's dependent. Then we have a fanboys conjunction, independent. No conjunction, independent. Omitted that, which is a relative pronoun, relative clause. Awubis word, if, dependent clause. Whew! Now let me ask you a question. Did good old Charles Dickens sit down to write this sentence and say to himself, I think I'll have 3 independent clauses, 2 dependent, and a relative? No, of course not. He was concentrating on telling a story and writing interesting characters, just like Emily Bronte did in Wuthering Heights, and like Barbara Jordan was concentrating on sending a message to the Democrats, and Elie Wiesel on urging people not to turn a blind eye to injustice. But while that was their focus, all of them had excellent writing skills, including the use of a variety of sentence types. That's one of the things that makes their writing good. They change up the length and rhythm and don't get into a rut with the same subject, verb, object over and over. That's it for the 4 main sentence types. By the way, this was supposed to be the last video in the series for now, but I just couldn't help myself. I've already written up another one on artistic fragments. Don't miss it. It's all about breaking the rules enthusiastically. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. And if you find these videos helpful, please consider supporting ELA Academy on Patreon. This is ELA Academy.